For everyone with an interest in MASH or more broadly, steatotic liver disease, Surf's Up, Season 5, Episode 25 of Surfing the MASH Tsunami, our review with co-author Maru Ranella of the recent expert recommendations for the use of Resmetirom starts now.
This week on Surfing the MASH Tsunami.
What we did is we benchmarked it to the diagnosis of MASLD, which is going to inherently include at least one cardiometabolic risk factor. The truth is most people who have F2-3 disease and increased liver stiffness in this context probably have more than one cardiometabolic risk factor, but we didn't specify more a priori.
Joern was talking about how these are the patients who want to treat first, second, third, right?
Oh, right.
Here, I think we were talking about threshold. Who should be getting this? Mm-hmm. And I read this more as a threshold paper than one could interpret in a prioritizing if one needed to do that.
You're right. It's a threshold paper, and particularly emphasizing who not to treat.
I think what was also important in the paper was you lead very well to how to stabilize, and stabilization of a patient's disease at that level of borderline cirrhosis, then stabilization of that condition is really important to prevent portal hypertension and a progressive disease.
I think Dr. Red and Maru did very well, and again, it's also very well taken. I can reflect on the NITs chosen. This wasn't a simple job. It's not easy to define these. And again, I think the evidence of starting treatment much stronger than recommending who to stop.
Every week, a global community of steatotic liver disease stakeholders comes together to explore the most critical challenges in diagnosing, treating, and developing medications for patients with MASLD and MASH. Join hepatology researcher and key opinion leader Joern Schattenberg, liver health advocate Louise Campbell, pricing and forecasting guru Roger Green, and this week's guest, hepatology researcher and key opinion leader Maru Ranella, as they discuss the recent paper sharing expert recommendations for the use of Resmetirom, this week on Surfing the MASH Tsunami.
Remember to stay tuned after this episode for this week's question of the week.
Hi, this is Roger. This week we scheduled and held a fantastic recording session with Maru Ranella discussing the recent CGH article on expert recommendations for the use of Resmetirom. Unfortunately, some of that episode got drowned in some internet problems that Maru had, so this episode has a couple holes in it and it's a bit patchy. Even so, there's so much fantastic information that we felt it worthwhile to bring to you, so sit back and enjoy. So it's the first time in, several weeks that we've had Louise, Joern, and me all on the same episode. We've had some success getting any two of us to an episode, but all three is a little bit challenging. And we have Maru with us as well, so this is going to be great fun, and I think a good evening. Going from east to west, I think we start with Louise, right? Because where are you tonight, Louise?
I'm in the Rhodope Mountains in Bulgaria, so just up on the top. We were overlooking Greece earlier today, so that's quite nice. On our way back to Sofia to fly to London tomorrow. So
then on to Canada on Friday, right?
Yep.
Mm-hmm. So, Joern, instead of being 1 hour later than you, she's 1 hour earlier today. How are you doing?
I'm good. I was just looking up how far Bulgaria is. That's 2,000 kilometers right there, Louise, from where I'm sitting. So, I think London is it's not even that way, 800 kilometers from here. So you're further out than usual. I'm sitting here in middle grounds, good old Europe, very excited about the Olympic Games, and I'm fine. Thank you, Roger.
Good to hear that. And Maru, I guess we should go to me next because I'm in Philadelphia. We'll go to you next. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. So I'm in Chicago, and it's gloomy outside, but it's upbeat here, so we're good with that.
It's still probably my favorite American city, in part because my daughter lives there, in part because it's just such a great city. And in New Hope, it's 30 degrees or 85, depending on how you want to count, on the river, and sunny and delightful. And if any of you knows what to do when your pepper garden goes crazy, please let me know, because we're harvesting a couple of dozen hot peppers a day. We couldn't eat them even if we didn't care about our tongues. So anyone who has good suggestions, please let me know. With that, why don't we just go straight to groundbreakers and then dive into our topic. One good thing, personal, professional, that's happened in the last week. Brave one, go first.
Well, I haven't been on for some time, so I'm going to start. I'm excited because we're ready to go off to a short vacation in Italy. That's a personal highlight of course. Professionally, yeah, I think the last week's been good. Things settling in. And again, excited to be on with you guys on the podcast here.
Good. Next.
Oh, I'll jump in. Just over a week ago, I actually had my graduation at the Royal College of Physicians for my fellowship, which, as we know, I'm the only nurse that we know of ever to be awarded a full fellowship, which is groundbreaking in its own way, but also I think it lends to the fact that we're now becoming more collegiate between physicians and allied health and nurses. And I think that was a great honour. But it's not just me, it's my patients, my colleagues, past, present, and the ones in the future that have allowed this to all happen. So I feel very honoured. And I got to wear purple, my favourite colour. And as a friend commented, I'd do anything to wear purple. But it was
This is fabulous.
it was good.
You look fabulous in purple. I think that's right.
Absolutely amazing. Congratulations, Louise.
Yeah, congratulations. I definitely can't top that. So
don't try, but go ahead anyway.
All right. So personally, I would say my kitchen, which has been under construction for like a month, is finally starting to be finished, which is really, that's where I was up until about 5 minutes ago, trying to deal with the contractors. And professionally, it's kind of been a slow week, but in the last 2 or 3 weeks, we got this paper published finally. It's out. So I'll take credit for that.
That's great news.
That's great. I know your old kitchen, so I want to come over for the new one, Maru.
Yeah, you're going to like it. It's really cool. The whole bottom floor has essentially been redone because I had mission creep.
Yeah, that happens in construction, doesn't it? From time to time.
Yes.
Okay, so I guess my good personal news, I had a birthday last week. Not a particularly eventful birthday in terms of the number, but I guess I'm old enough that every time I have a birthday, that's one more reason to celebrate. Very, very quiet day, except I get to hang out with my granddaughter a little bit, which makes every day of my life better when I get to do that. Professionally, I'm excited that we were able to get Maru on such short notice that we can talk about this paper the week after you folks pressed it. We always try to do that. It works sometimes, it doesn't work others, but this is an important paper. So I'm delighted that we're here. With that, why don't we dive in? Okay, audience, show of hands. How many of you have seen this paper so far? Just kidding, because the only people who can put their hands up are the people who are on the video. But this paper published in CGH last week, Clinical Gastroenterology and Hepatology, long awaited. In fact, Michael Charlton talked about this paper coming when he appeared on an episode earlier this year. He said that this would be coming out at some point in the next couple of months. I think that was about 3 months ago, and here we are. Maru is the corresponding author. Therefore, we'll get to speak for all your colleagues today, which is a good thing. I just want to make this simple. I mean, really, 4 topics. Number 1 is the history of the paper, how it came to be written, what you thought were the most important things you're trying to achieve. And then the 3 major issues of patient selection, monitoring for efficacy or acceptable efficacy and what that entailed, and then safety. So we can kind of go through those one at a time, ask you to talk about it a little bit. We'll ask questions, and we'll have fun. Floor is yours.
Yeah, so conceptually, it was actually conceived before the approval, obviously, of Resmetirom, because we presumed that there was going to be a lot of interest in how to select patients, most importantly because we knew that biopsy was not going to be, or had a very good idea that biopsy was not going to be on the label, nor did anybody want it to be. And we wanted to develop practical guidance to be able to help people select the right patients and, importantly, not select the wrong patients. Our intention actually was to get this done the week after Stephen died. In fact, Stephen, the last thing he did was make comments on this paper. So that derailed things a bit, obviously, for us. So here we are now, a bit later. So the reason why I got a little bit delayed is because we were going a little bit back and forth on some of the cutoffs. Of course, perfect is the enemy of good, and this is where we ended up. Also, we're trying to help inform the AASLD update, which will be coming out shortly, but had to be a different document because they could only have people that are not actively involved in consulting in the field. So we were trying to help guide them a bit. So that's what took so long, essentially. Maybe we can start with that, I guess.
But it's very timely still, Maru. And of course, over here in Europe, as you know, we don't have Resmetirom approved yet. So we've been wandering and looking over to see how you guys are handling it. And I think the current paper is very practical, addressing the questions we're asking over here. And I think it's worth to actually walk through it one by one and look at the cutoffs, of course. But also I find it interesting that there's some very special considerations in terms of interactions and stopping rules, actually. But that's maybe jumping the gun. So going back to treating the right patients, how did you discuss to move from the NAS greater than 4, F2, F3, metabolically enriched population recommending NITs? I mean, how was the discussion there? Maybe you can recap a little bit on that, because, the histology seems easy, telling us inflammation and fibrosis. How'd the discussion go on the NITs there?
And of course, the Resmetirom study, the New England Journal, and all other advanced phase development studies are benchmarked on, steatohepatitis hepatitis or histology. We really kind of took the FDA label at face value and tried to use that guidance. We didn't really focus on the steatohepatitis component of it because that was not emphasized at all in the label. We are probably better at identifying, or actually without the problem, we're definitely best at identifying advanced fibrosis from a non-invasive test standpoint. And because at-risk MASH is the closest to the NAS of greater than or equal to 4 with F2-3, that's why we landed on that and used NITs that have been selected or developed for that purpose. And so that's where you see the FAST and the MAST in the guidance to try and provide a population that's most likely to have the right disease, so to speak.
And I fully agree. I think this is great. I guess my one thought I have, and I'm looking at the boxes you made. So the green box and in the paper with the treat indication is VCTE between 10 and 15 kPa, or some other test that might even depict at-risk MASH, which you could choose. I guess I would consider a patient in that VCTE if he has slightly elevated ALT. I guess it's not true that the patient with normal ALT doesn't have the disease, but if I have limited access to the drug in the beginning, I probably still treat the ones with a little higher ALT first. I'm not sure you discussed that. And I guess it's in the FAST somehow, right?
We debated putting an additional liver enzyme, actually AST threshold in there, and then we decided against it because there are patients who don't have that. I believe somewhere in the text we talk about that, but that, as you mentioned, is included in the FAST. Yeah, you're right. I mean, most people who have an AST of less than, certainly less than 20, and most who have an AST less than 30 are not going to have that degree of fibrosis. We also went back and forth actually to the FibroScan point. We went back and forth as to whether we should include a second value, right? Because you're going to get higher accuracy and less misclassification if you have repeated measures. And we ended up deciding to not do it just from a practical standpoint. Many clinics do not have FibroScan, and it's impractical to have somebody come and have it done again in order to confirm to start a drug. So that was the reasoning for not having a secondary VCTE included.
Yeah, got it. I want to hear what Roger and Luis says. I guess my only other thought is in the Maestro-NASH trial, we enrolled patients with those 3 metabolic risk factors. And I think you're discussing this in the text at length. So the question is, in a prioritization approach, should we really, MASLD with metabolic comorbidities, it's good enough to have one.
Yeah, so I really don't think it should be limited to that population. That's really not realistic. And the purpose of doing that,
I was thinking about the 3 metabolic risk factors in the trial.
And the rationale for that was, of course, to start with an enriched population and have lower screen failure rates predominantly, if I recall, but maybe you have another take on that. So what we did is we benchmarked it to the diagnosis of MASLD, which is going to inherently include at least one cardiometabolic risk factor. The truth is most people who have F2-3 disease and increased liver stiffness in this context probably have more than one cardiometabolic risk factor, but we didn't specify more a priori.
Which is perfectly fine. Again, I agree with you. It's about reducing screen failure in a clinical trial, clinical situation. We're different. It's also enriching for a population that doesn't spontaneously revert disease, which is important for the sponsor. So it's a little different situation. I think I agree.
So implicit in Jörn's question was the idea that a lot of this is about prioritization, which I think is something we worry about more. They worry about more in Europe than they do in the States. In the States, kind of anybody who should get it can get it, right? And in Europe, you worry a lot more about how to manage the resource. So I didn't read this with a strong implicit sense of prioritization in it.
What do you mean by that?
Well, Jörn was talking about how these are the patients we want to treat first, second, third, right?
Oh, right.
Here, I think we're talking about threshold. Who should be getting this? Mm-hmm. And I read this more as a threshold paper that one could interpret in a prioritizing if one needed to do that, than as compared to you folks setting markers and saying, here's where we go first, here's where we go second, here's where we go third.
Yeah, we didn't do that because we really didn't think there was enough evidence to actually justify that. So this is representing what we know now through the lens of experts in the field. So I anticipate that this will continue to evolve over time, particularly with respect to assessment of treatment response. That's where we really have very, very little data. And to be honest, that was not very reliable in this study, which puts you in a situation where essentially everybody stays on drug and you don't really have a specific way or a reason to stop it per se. So we didn't want to give that message at all. So that's why we did provide some stopping rules, I guess. But it is really, you're right, it's a threshold paper, and particularly emphasizing who not to treat. And in the US, the other thing that came up that would be relevant for Europe and maybe less relevant in the US is the cost. cost. So we did not include the cost, and we didn't provide caveats about the cost because we anticipate the cost will drop significantly. We really think it's going to have to. And it's, at least in the US market, it's not really my job to comment on cost because that will get regulated on its own. We had that same approach with the HCV guidelines. I wasn't part of that, but I know that the way that they framed it was completely irrespective of what the cost was, which was egregious. I don't know if you remember,
yes.
But it was like over $100,000 for treatment for that. What they decided then is to ignore the cost and just provide what would be their best advice, just looking at the drugs available. And lo and behold, they dropped to extremely affordable prices over time. So that's why we didn't make caveats about the cost.
And that's perfectly reasonable because it's the scientific way to look at things. As you said, there is no evidence we can base prioritizations based on in the clinical trial. I think even post hoc responder analysis. And I have one question regarding dosing, maybe with you, but the systems, is then a political discussion. How much money is in the system? How much money do you want to spend? And that's kind of out of the doctor's realm. I agree.
So given that I was doing pricing and forecasting around the time of the original effective HCV drugs and have never gotten screamed at so much in interviews in my life.
And then that also goes alongside with, how comfortable are you to falsely classify, somebody as F2/3 when they have earlier stage disease, for example?
We don't, although
in the US, I think we have a much higher level of comfort with that than in Europe because we don't have to worry so much about the prioritization, for better or for worse.
Part of what happened with HCV, in fact, is that managed care and particularly Medicaid imposed prioritization because they couldn't afford to give the drug to everybody the drug was indicated for. So they actually went and forced the prioritization that didn't exist. Now, I don't think that's likely to be the case here because there was such a large warehouse of patients waiting for those drugs that if everybody who a doctor wanted to prescribe those drugs for had gotten it at the hundreds. I mean, we had Medicaid in certain states telling us that they were going to completely blow up state budgets simply based on that one drug at $100-something thousand a year. This, I think, is different.
Right.
Not as many patients are identified and certainly not warehoused. I don't think. I haven't seen that.
I don't know how many are warehoused, Roger. I mean, it's less than you think, I think, actually.
I was just going to ask a question on that. When we talk about costs, I've heard that there's various insurers looking to just maintain liver biopsy as a way of getting access to the drugs, and certainly different organizations. And I think what the paper did was do a really nice description of how to use non-invasive technologies, multiple together, to actually try and risk stratify and get the right population. So do we think that will help the insurance companies start to access these medications, or do we think that will still keep biopsy as an obstruction to some of those patients, given the risks that biopsy still holds?
Right. Yeah, that's a great question. So I do think that insurers will do what they usually do in this country, which is look at the guidance and then sort of use that as their benchmark. I have not yet encountered a compulsory liver biopsy prior to approval of treatment. I have about probably 5 patients on it right now. So I've not seen that, but that's a very small sample. So I have not heard that either, but that very well may be the case. What I think is important for people to understand is that because of the imperfect nature, and I just read through quickly the paper this morning just to kind of refresh myself, there are several places where it does say if there's indeterminate results or there's discrepant results, or you clinically really think that this person has F2/3 disease and that's not what you're getting on your NITs, biopsy is still there and an option, but we just don't want that to be the first go-to, obviously.
And Louise, to some degree, going back to Maru's previous point, the fact that there doesn't appear to be a ton of warehousing, and Maru, I did some interviewing with people on how much warehousing existed before the drug was approved, just for a couple of investment clients of ours. So I agree with you. I think that the fear of warehousing here is nothing like what you saw with HCV for a whole bunch of reasons. And that, in fact, will serve to reduce the demand for biopsy, because what biopsy becomes is a way to put the brakes on if you think you're getting too much use too fast and you're a payer, and either you can't trust the drug enough yet or you don't have the money in your budget. If those things aren't happening, and I think Madrigal has done a really nice job of trying to control the roll rate on the launch and uptake of the drug, then it's not typical in the States for people to impose that kind of thing. I mean, VA did it, but I don't know. I haven't seen a lot of it in private insurance yet. I don't know about you, Maru.
They did it with Hep C, as you said, but I haven't seen it other than that.
With Hep C, everybody did it, yeah. So at any rate, why don't we go on to efficacy and times to screen and what we're looking for? And again, do us a favor, walk us through.
Right. So the rationale for selecting people with F2 disease or higher is, of course, because that stage and beyond that stage have a demonstrable difference in long-term survival than people with less disease. So that's the baseline reason why that's the patient population that you want to select. And you, of course, want to exclude people with cirrhosis, not because we don't think the drug will not work in cirrhosis. In In fact, I can't remember the number, Jorn, you may remember, but it was actually not a small number. I want to say about probably 75 patients or so had cirrhosis on the trial. Afterwards, it was appreciated they had cirrhosis, and they did just fine. The issue really more with cirrhosis is, should the dose be different because of the pharmacodynamics? Maybe 60 milligrams is a better dose if you have cirrhosis, for example. So that was really just for safety reasons that we did that, not because we really think it's unsafe. But Jorn, why don't you comment on that too, actually?
Sure. I think the important message here is the Maestro outcomes trial is currently running, and there is data being generated in patients with cirrhosis. So we'll see more of that, and I anticipate to see an effect here. It's important to see that the label does not include cirrhosis. So that's the important, on the payer side, the important reason to exclude that. And I agree, in particular in compensated cirrhosis, I don't see safety signals. Now, there's been some thinking that in particular as the disease stage progresses, there could be less thyroid hormone receptor beta in the liver. So it remains to be shown that these patients are benefit. And I think that's the strongest reason to also say it's not explored. The data is coming. We'll get it down. And I don't remember the number on how many patients on end of treatment biopsy. I guess you're commenting on where then cirrhotic. I could look it up. But yeah, no safety signals. And again, it's a very safe drug from everything that we know.
Yeah. It was presented, I think, in abstract form. I don't know if it's in print anywhere. I have to dig for that. But there were patients. I mean, the point is there were more than a handful of patients that had compensated cirrhosis. And as you know, if you're a clinician, I mean, you know that the line between F3 and F4 is, first of all, somewhat artificial, right? You're talking about a 1/40,000th piece of your liver. And there are areas where you're going to see a full nodule. You're going to call that cirrhosis. There are areas where you're not going to see a full nodule. Even though it's probably there, you're going to call that F3. So it's obviously a continuous scale of fibrosis. And it really actually, I think, comes down to that's where I think NITs are really helpful and maybe better than liver biopsy. They are better than liver biopsy, actually.
Yeah. So. And I would probably start considering a patient cirrhotic when it drops below the 150, right? So that's when we normally see the red number, because 150 is typically the lower limit of normal. Mm-hmm. In the Maestro NASH trial, it was allowed it down to 140. And I think that's the cutoff you're discussing in the CGH paper too. So, some very early cirrhosis, not really full-blown clinical significant portal hypertension is probably good. And there were some patients in that trial, but not aiming for that. We're aiming for those F3s.
Yeah, but you've made the point on a couple of earlier episodes, and I think the paper to some degree gets here as well, that because the drug is as safe as it is, and because, as Maru points out, the boundary between F3 and F4 is as hazy as it is, if you miss a little bit and wind up giving the drug to compensated cirrhosis patients, you're probably not causing any significant safety harm.
I'm not worried at all.
No, but I think what was also important in the paper was you lead very well to how to stabilize, and stabilization of a patient's disease progression was also well defined or looked at within the paper, which was quite nice, as well as some of the stopping. But I think if you're at that level of borderline cirrhosis, then stabilization of that condition is really important to prevent portal hypertension and a progressive disease. And I think that was one thing a lot of the patient advocacy groups do call for and have done for a long time, to consider stabilization of disease and non-progression. So I thought that was an excellent part.
You're 100% right about that. It's not going to be it's not an endpoint at this point, but I completely agree. And Arun demonstrated that those who don't progress, those who revert out of cirrhosis are going to have less liver-related outcomes. So it is absolutely clinically relevant. I think especially the more advanced you get, but really anywhere other than cirrhosis, it's very relevant, I think.
To some degree, I think this paper kind of makes that point, right? I mean, the working definition of continuing therapy is if people aren't getting worse, keep them on it.
I mean, that's what we believe.
Look, it makes sense, and papers that have been published subsequently, the idea that it takes as long as it does for people after bypass surgery, for many people after bypass surgery to exhibit a one-level reduction in, from F4 down to F3, says that stabilization is a perfectly reasonable goal. And as long as people are stable, they could be slowly getting better if you're using the kind of ordinal scales that we're talking about here.
I agree. Again, that was one of the things we really grappled with is, are we basically saying that essentially everybody should just stay on forever? And that's not what we're trying to say. We weren't trying to say, but the problem is that it is a safe drug. It's very well tolerated. And, it could be that you don't see demonstrable improvements in liver enzymes and the person's getting better. And that's even true for PDFF, actually. So for people I think it was about a third of people who had improvement on histology did not have an improvement in ALT. So that's why it was difficult to provide, this is what treatment response looks like. We don't have a good handle on that for this disease, for this mechanism, or actually for others, really. But this, I think, was more challenging maybe than others in that way.
That point is well made, Maru. And you said that in the beginning, the evidence of recommending treatment and eruption is clearly much less there compared to which patients should be treated. There's some data presented here by us, or Mazen Nureddin was first author on that paper looking at 3 years declines in VCTE using resmetirom in a post hoc analysis. And actually a considerable amount of patients went below the 10 kilopascal, starting above to 10 kilopascal. And if you look at everything that we know today, that's probably a pretty good sign. And that wasn't seen to the same extent at 52 weeks. So there is an extended response, and we all tend to think fibrosis moves slowly. We know that it does. I agree with you that if you have a good indication to start treatment, stopping treatment at 12 months, and I understand that's the first time point where you actually consider that unless there's toxicity. It needs a strong rationale, and the data on that is not as strong as compared to putting patients on drug in the beginning.
Yeah, and I think as we go on, the case for improvement being incremental over time and our scales not being good enough to capture them just keeps growing stronger and stronger. The paper that came out a couple of months ago that had used the PathAI-ML system to look at the SEMA trial that said that if you use that system, there's clearly a significant response in terms of fibrosis that just doesn't get picked up on a CRN scale. So we're going to see that over and over again, and that makes this recommendation make more and more sense as we get more confirmation of that.
Still, putting on my European hat, we're going to have that discussion, because if we have limited resources, we got to decide which patients to prioritize.
Opt for better tests.
I agree with everything Jorn says most of the time. So
I said you invite me over for dinner in your new kitchen.
Yeah, it makes for a boring podcast if you agree with Jorn on everything. So we try to find something not to agree with him on. It's really, really work. I got to tell you, it's one of the hardest things we have to do is to not agree with Jorn. Louise, it's your turn. Comments, questions, thoughts?
No, I just thought it was a great paper. And I think a lot of the evidence, as the paper alludes to, will come out in the wash as we go forward. And we have more non-invasive technologies being used in units as people progress on treatment. And we get to the 3-month, the 6-month, the 9-month, the 12-month time points to be able to assess patients. And I think this gave a very good guideline. Obviously, for me doing FibroScans, what I'm looking for is that 30% reduction or that 30% increase. I think defining that in those populations, if we're dealing with those populations in the future on the drug, those are the conversations that we're looking at. And it's how do we interpret that and place it into care and the discussion with the patient. That is part of where we will go in the future as we progress. The paper was beautiful in saying a lot of this is unknown, but we are getting there. The real world evidence is going to provide masses in the next 6, 9, 12 months because we'll be further down that timeline. What was key here, we have often discussed on the podcast futility rules, and there was an alluding to the futility rules of if you're progressing up kilopascals, if you're not improving and your liver function is deteriorating in that way, then these may be reasons to look at futility. But again, it wasn't a one-size-fits-all, which I thought was beautiful. And I think the paper, for me, described that nicely. And if I could follow it, I'd take that as a great one.
It probably needs a certain margin of error with the progression of VCTE, Louise, you said. And I think the literature kind of shoots in on the 30%. I guess you can say if it's 20% up, there's still increase. So I think it's not just the number going up by 1. There needs to be a certain margin there if we do repeat testing. I mean, the one question I do have for Maru, I guess the questions I have here is that the drug is approved in conjunction with diet and exercise. And in your 6 patients that you mentioned, how do you do that? You just tell them to diet and exercise. You probably did before, right? So I think it's an important message.
It is. The way I interpret that is that you provide standard of care. And standard of care really needs to be providing lifestyle advice to these patients. And so that's the way I interpreted the FDA label, is do what you're meant to be doing as a baseline, and then this is therapy on top of that. That's the way I interpret it.
Second short question, short answer is how about GLP-1? Are they all on GLP-1 because resmetirom is in weight neutral drug, or you pick the ones that are not on GLP-1 yet?
So I've either picked people who don't need to be or can't be on a GLP-1. I don't necessarily do a GLP-1 first per se because we don't have good data on fibrosis at this point. So and resmetirom is so easy and well tolerated. I think it can be used in conjunction. One of the patients has been on GLP-1 for a year and I started them on it. So I think it just depends on the scenario, the patient scenario and preferences as well.
So Maru, the other thing I thought that was interesting is not only the idea about the value of repeated tests being mentioned, but also the need for multiple NITs. The more signals you get marching in the same direction intervention, whether that be at once or over time, without even necessarily saying specifically which ones they have to be, but they need to be multiple. And don't trust FIB4 to do this. I think it's helpful because...
And remember, use your clinical acumen. Remember, you're treating providers, so use your clinical acumen.
At the end of the day, yeah, we want people who think, and can use their own experiences. Jorn, other questions on defining patient population, defining efficacy, defining futility?
No, I think Dr. Red and Maru did very well. And again, it's also very well taken. I can reflect on the NIT's chosen. This wasn't a simple job. It's not easy to define these. And again, I think the evidence of starting treatment much stronger than recommending who to stop. We'll learn more over time, and I think it's a good starting point. I'll be reaching out to you, Maru, again, once we have the drug available here, of course, before, but then learn from your experience.
Yeah, I mean, perfect is the enemy of good. We tried our very best to try to balance practicality with the evidence we have, and I'm sure that we weren't perfect in that, and I know we weren't, but we tried.
But you're good. You're really good, which is all you're trying to do, right? I want to go back to Jorn's last comment, which is, Jorn, I think there's a practicality to not discontinuing therapy too early, please pardon the double negative, in that if we're trying to learn over time when to stop, you can't learn when to stop if you're always stopping too early. So if you use the most rigorous stopping rules you can create, you're never going to figure out who you shouldn't have stopped with. Whereas if you gather enough data on people who are in kind of that middle zone, you can figure out over time what you might not have chosen to continue.
And I mean, the important message is this is an ongoing trial, right? So we're talking about the pre-PAMP interim analysis for conditional approval here. And we learned a lot and we have a drug, but the study is continuing. That's important, and patients have to stay on drug in the trial, and we have to continue this trial. And we'll learn a lot more from it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Maru, can I ask you, how do the patients feel going onto it? Are they excited? How do they actually respond to the treatment and in that motivation?
So people are really excited. I think for me, it's been harder to tell patients of mine that I've been following for years that they don't meet criteria, because that's happening actually quite a bit as well. So people who are getting to start it are really excited about it. I will say I have not yet seen somebody in follow-up to determine their treatment response. I haven't yet seen anybody in follow-up to determine treatment response. So that'll be an interesting conversation. I haven't had that yet.
When you do you ask them, are they making other lifestyle changes more than they would have done before because they're on the medication? Have they suddenly changed their diet because, oh, right, now this is serious? All of those confounders that we see in placebo line, that because you're on a treatment.
I would say that they were already getting that advice. They follow with my dietitian already. That's part of my clinic. So they see a dietitian in my clinic. They are getting lifestyle advice and coaching every single time they see me. So we talk about, cardiometabolic risk factors and weight at every visit. So I don't think it's any different than what we do anyway, to be honest. And then we're adding on meds, which, they really shouldn't produce a lot of symptoms. I haven't heard any symptoms for many of my patients yet, but I have a small N, so I can't really comment on that. I don't anticipate there are going to be a lot of side effects.
The one thing is interactions. You have a short section on drug-drug interactions in there. There is something on antiplatelet therapy. I mean, overall, it's a very safe drug, and the interactions are with clopidogrel, potentially, as a moderate CYP2CE inhibitor.
Yeah, exactly. We didn't harp too much on this, other than, certainly we do know about those drug interactions. We know about the potential interaction with cyclosporin, of course, as well. So I think we don't know enough yet. And I don't think it means that you cannot use those drugs, but I think it does mean that you need to very carefully monitor people who are on those drugs or who need to be on those drugs. So it's hard to give more recommendations than that. We just haven't had enough real life practice with it. And we know with statins, actually, that there also is a reaction, or at least there's an interaction, but you have to really use super therapeutic doses of a statin to see that. So we did not harp on that because I don't think it's clinically relevant, actually. And the one thing I think is clinically relevant is you're going to see your LDL come down. And so that's something just to, you may need a lesser dose of a statin, actually.
And that's great. But I think it's good you're discussing it in it, because you're leaving the clinical trial space now where you have a super tight feedback and observation. So it's important for people to remind it that there could be some very few non-critical interactions to be thought of.
Noting that you don't give specific recommendations on how people should keep an eye on that, I assume that you're trusting that to clinical acumen. If you're going to give a dose that's got one of those effects.
Yeah, you have to just keep an eye on it. And for statins, we provide the 20 milligrams of Prava or a atorvastatin to 40, but you're not usually going to give more than that anyway, clinically. So I think we're asking people to do what they probably are already doing anyway, if they're using the dosing like you're supposed to be using the dosing of the statin.
Okay. I have one more set of questions, which is, are you hearing anything yet, although it's only been a week, about the playthrough of the paper and how it's being used or how people expect it will be used, besides what Jorn said about prioritizing in Europe? But no, I'm seriously, how do you expect this will be used?
Yeah, so I expect it to be used by care providers. So anybody who's facing a patient who's considering using the medication. So it's really meant for those providers. That's the purpose of this, is to guide providers on the front lines, essentially.
Our advantage is we've already approved the drug in the EASL guidelines for European use before it's even approved in Europe. And we're going to have these guidelines and the benefit of probably another 6 months. So we'll be coming from a position of strength.
I hope so. I hope it'll be used in Europe as well. But Jorn?
Well, for sure. Currently, the guideline says consider if available. And so I'll have a little bit more water down the Rhine to wait for that drug to arrive. But I'm very optimistic.
Yeah, hopefully soon, right?
So, and Jorn, Louise, you think this paper in itself will have significantly in Germany and the UK, and Australia's not going to get this drug for years?
Academically, we love to debate cutoffs. And now if that group of authors, which is, everybody you got to talk to about NITs, if you take this to another group of authors, they're going to come up with different set of cutoffs. And so I think there will be quite some cutoff discussions around this, Maroon. You might have had some feedback on that. But again, this is academically, and we need those discussions. And I think it will help us and evolve the field.
In fact, that was part of, I think, what, we were really trying to refine that, because we had 3 reviewers for this paper. Clearly, they were NIT experts, and maybe you were one of them, I don't know. But in any case, so we did really, I think, benefit and hopefully reached an acceptable, reasonable middle ground with what some of the really excellent points that were made by the reviewers of this paper.
Roger, on your point of Australia, I think the more that papers like this are put together about how serial NITs can be used, including VCTE and the other mechanisms, the much stronger the argument goes for Australia that they can evidence-base that. There is potentially a resistance because there's no particular definition and cutoffs. As we go further on, the wealth of experience that Maru, Europe and the teams get together, then it helps base that case. We have to move beyond biopsy in areas like Australia. We have to fight the case to get it on Medicare so that people get access to it, because Australia is unfortunately one of the growing and leading populations of liver cancers and real problems with fatty liver disease and MASLD and MASH. So there are opportunities here to leapfrog from being one of the poorest provided for to actually use their mechanism and their current healthcare to leapfrog with all of this evidence. And I'd like to see that as where we go in Australia, not just reinvent and wait, because there are people there really struggling with this disease. And we do not have a transplant program in Australia able to support what is coming in any way, shape or form. And we have to really look at how do we provide in a country that doesn't have a transplant program that can provide the number of transplants for women that are going to increase exponentially with MASH in the future. These are all considerations that need to be put forward. But I do think the government is listening from what I can hear and what I can tell in the ground force. But it's still going to take a while, but I do think they're listening.
That's great to hear.
Yeah, I think so. Maru, this has been fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us to do this. Jorn, you got any questions, comments in closing?
Looking forward to the summer. Not sure you had your break yet, Maru, but great paper. Congratulations to you and the co-authors. And, made me think of Stephen again. I remember you told me he was writing on this paper.
Yeah. All of us, I think.
Yeah, I saved that email. It was his last email. Anyway, yeah. Well, thank you for the invite. It was fun, as always.
Yes, and we're delighted to have you with us.
And now, here's Roger with this week's question of the week.
And here's our question of the week. This week, Maru Ranella walks us through expert recommendations on the use of Resmetirom, including patient identification, efficacy-based continuation and futility rules, and safety or dosing issues. 2 striking recommendations were: 1, using multiple NITs to decide whether a given patient qualifies as an at-risk MASH patient, therefore a good candidate for Resmetirom, and 2, continuing therapy unless and until a patient shows signs of disease progression. Which of these do you feel will have greater impact on how physicians treat with Resmetirom, and why do you say that?
And now for the Season 5, Episode 25 Business Report.
Slava Ukraini, glory to Ukraine, Heroim Slava, glory to heroes, and also Am Yisrael Chai, the people of Israel live. There's enough political energy going in the U.S. this week to light up everybody. So let's keep it simple and simply remember and respect the brave Ukrainian fighters and residents who are fighting for democracy on behalf of themselves and all of us. In Israel, forces from the north, according to the U.S. Secretary of State clearly Hezbollah, bombed a soccer field and killed 12 children and teens on Saturday night. Interestingly, the people who were killed were Muslims, which speaks eloquently to the underlying respect that Israelis have for human life, regardless of religion or creed. Remember our episode last October when Professor Oren Shibboleth talked about how closely he worked with co-workers of all religions and backgrounds? Well, some of that's been lost perhaps with this government, but it still underlies how a lot of Israelis think. And with that in mind, let's remember and wish for the safe and speedy return of the many remaining Israeli hostages. Remember and pray for the safety of the Gazan residents whose needs are poorly served by their government's approach to the situation. And let's hope that all people can find their peaceful bearings. Heroim Slava, glory to heroes, and also Am Yisrael Chai, the people of Israel live.
Next week, our vacations start.
As Jordan mentioned today, he's off to Italy on holiday the next 2 weeks. I am off to the Jersey Shore for 2 weeks, starting the second week of Jordan's 2-week holiday. So we're attempting to record 2 episodes over the next week, one probably Thursday or Friday. Louise will run at least 1 episode while I'm gone. I'll have more on that next week.
To be part of an episode, come join us discussing the question of the week.
Last week, we discussed question of the week answers with 2 of our panelists, but were unable to align schedules with those who actually wrote the answers. This week's question considers how the expert recommendations we discussed today will shape Resmetirom prescribing and management in the U.S. and Europe. It's an important topic. I believe everybody who's a stakeholder in this market will have something to say. I bet you've got a thought you'd like to share. Just respond, and we'll bring you on with us to talk about it.
Office hours are on hold until the end of August, after the vacations.
We'll hold regular office hours next Wednesday, August 7th at 11 a.m., which is 5 p.m. in Central Europe, 4 p.m. in British time zone, 10 a.m. in the Central U.S. time zone. After that, I'll be off 2 weeks, so no office hours again until August 28th.
This week's Vault looks at some practical issues around NITs and incretin agonists.
This week's episode looks back at our wrap-up from Paris NASH 2023, hereafter known as Paris MASH. Laurent Castera and Scott Friedman discussed 2 sets of issues relevant to appropriate prescribing. That's it for today. I want to thank Maru for joining us despite her kitchen construction and dicey internet service, and Jordan and Louise for their usual excellent participation. Please take a listen to our question of the week, and now that you know where it can get you, reply. If you're a LinkedIn follower, check your in-mail or messages for an invitation to subscribe to our weekly piece, and for how to access my weekly office hours, Wednesdays at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. As I say, we're still working out which episode to use next week, but all our ideas are pretty exciting, so stay safe, surf on. See you next week on the podcast. Bye-bye now.
Have any questions for the surfers? You can send them to questions@surfingmash.com and we will answer on the podcast or website. Your question might even wind up being the question of the week.